Today we are checking out another 10 sequels that started off in the arcade and went straight to console, as well as home computers for the sequels and spin-offs, totally bypassing arcade releases altogether. Some of these releases are just so good that it would make you wonder why some of these weren't actual arcade games at all. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, many arcade classics, which have also now become household names, ended up getting okay to fairly questionable home computer and console conversions. That is not the case here though. You cannot really scrutinise a game that wasn't attempting to bring us arcade quality on a mere 8-bit computer, for example. If you have yet to watch the first part of this video, which I released almost 2 weeks back, be sure to watch it after this part, as many will argue that I haven't included particular sequels, which if not in this video will highly likely be in the previous video. So in this part of sequels with no arcade release, we are taking another look at mainly 8 to 32-bit system sequels, and will include everything from shoot 'em ups, beat 'em ups and racers. And just like the last video too, some of these games will likely surprise you that either you were certain that these were arcade games initially that were then ported, and some of these 10 games you may have never heard of before or not known about. All I can tell you is that this list comprises of some absolutely amazing sequels guaranteed. I'll link the first part of the video in the comments section so you can watch even more of these truly amazing non-arcade sequels. So anyways, let's crack on and see what was another 10 of the best non-arcade sequels. After the phenomenal success of the original Final Fight 1989 arcade game, which was also ported to various home computers and consoles, Capcom in 1993 decided to release Final Fight's sequel direct to console, and more specifically for the Super Nintendo. For those of you who was disappointed with the original SNES game only having a one-player option, then Capcom listened when they incorporated a two-player option with Final Fight 2. This is a direct sequel and only features one playable character from the original game, which is of course Mike Hagar. The two new playable additions are Collis and Mackie, two very nice playable characters in the game. A very similar game to Final Fight, we battle our way through various streets ranging from European countries to Japan and beyond. 6 fairly large stages in total, with 2 bonus stages chucked in too. The enemies are very different here, which means that instead of reusing sprites, we have a new set of enemies to battle in this game. The only remaining characters from the 1989 conversion and the arcade game itself is the Andor family, who have also become iconic to Capcom's beat 'em up franchises over the years. The story of Final Fight 2 is fairly straightforward. After the defeat of the Mad Gear Gang, Cody and Guy went their separate ways, doing their own things, and Mike Hagar remained the mayor of Metro City, and this is why only Mike returns for this sequel. The Mad Gear Gang could not stand the defeat from the first game and so wanted revenge. The controls in this game are virtually the same as the first game for the Super Nintendo. 2 buttons, one for action and one for jumping, whilst pressing these together gives the player the special move ability, which of course also drains your health bar. Final Fight 2 had fairly positive reviews for its 1993 release, and was also available for Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console in 2009. There was also Final Fight 3, which was also an exclusive for the Super Nintendo in 1996, although both of these releases were pretty damn awesome. R-Type Delta was the 4th game to be released in the R-Type franchise and was an exclusive for PlayStation owners when it released back in 1998. It is also notable for being the first R-Type game to feature 3D graphics. The game was developed by IREM, the same development team that gave us the awesome original 1987 arcade game. Now, admittedly, much like most 32-bit console games, R-Type Delta hasn't aged too well over the years. However, if you play this on a CRTV or use a scaler such as the amazing OSSC, then this game can look just as good as it did back in 1998. So apart from the polygons and fancy 90s visuals in this game, this is an R-Type game through and through, no doubt about it. We have a choice of different ships to play as it also has options for different forces and wave cannon combinations, which gives the gameplay a little customization, if you will. A brand new addition to R-Type Delta is a dose system, which allows forces to absorb energy through collisions in projectiles or enemies. Once the gauge reaches 100%, we can then go on to use the Delta attack, which in other words means destroying everything on screen in a truly awesome R-Type spectacle. I'll be honest, I didn't buy this game back in the day. I am pretty sure I was knocking around with an N64 at this point. But it didn't take me long to discover it, and it has remained one of my personal favourite R-Type games to date. For those who wonder what my favourite horizontal shooter franchise is, well, it's very likely R-Type. So, is it a difficult game? Hell yes, remember this was IREM who gave this game 1987 R-Type difficulty too, as well as a similar feel to controlling the ships. I love R-Type, and if you haven't tried this PlayStation game, which I think is a little something of a hidden gem, seriously play it. Just play it using some form of scaler, as the polygons don't look great on modern day flat screen TVs without one. If you have never heard of Contra, then I would be truly surprised at this point, but for the other 99.9% of people who have heard of Contra, then this is Contra 3, the Alien Wars. Unlike the original Contra games, which were arcade releases, which then had various different home computer and console conversions, Contra 3, the Alien Wars by Konami was a straight-to-console game, originally releasing for the Super Nintendo back in 1992. It also appeared for the original Game Boy in 1994, although this was developed by Factor 5 rather than Konami. Finally, it also appeared on the Game Boy Advance in 2003, which went by the name of Contra 3, the Alien Wars X. So as for the game itself, damn, this game is a seriously good run and gun game, and likely one of the best, if not the best games of this genre on the Super Nintendo. It did everything that the previous game did, but only ramped it up to 100%. This is a non-stop blowing up, shooting up, killing up, ripping up masterpiece for the Nintendo console. It pretty much controls like any 2D Contra game, and it truly is a blast to play as you collect weapon power-ups and shoot down enemies from above. This is a very difficult game, but having said that, Contra has a reputation for being difficult anyways. If you are confused with the name of this game, it was released in Europe with a different name altogether, which was actually known as Super Protector Alien Rebels. Although the PAL versions of the game wasn't as smooth with frame rates, and so the best way of playing is the actual NTSC release of this game. The game did very well in its day and is considered Super Nintendo royalty and was praised for its use of Mode 7 implementation within the game. Interestingly, as popular as the original arcade game of Renegade was, and its many home conversions in which I've covered in my arcade port series, it never actually had an arcade release for a sequel. Instead, Target Renegade actually released for the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC in 1988. It also had a Nintendo Entertainment System release which arrived in 1990. At the time of Ocean's original arcade conversions, they also got the rights from Taito to produce sequels. Now, I have chosen the ZX Spectrum version because it is most loved by Spectrum fans as being one of the computer's best beat-em-ups, and yes, I also think this is true. There was actually a third Renegade game subtitled The Last Chapter, but to be fair, the game, which wasn't an arcade release either, was pretty much terrible in every way. I personally played the third game on the Commodore 64 back in the day, and yes, it was pretty shocking. So, Target Renegade, probably the ZX ZX Spectrum's answer to Streets of Rage, although that game came along a little later after this came out. It is a much loved side-scrolling beat-em-up, and if you love the option of 2-player co-op games, then the Spectrum and Amstrad versions did this, although the Nintendo Entertainment System and Commodore 64 versions didn't have this functionality. The game itself then, and specifically the ZX Spectrum version, is just such a decent beat-em-up. It's really nice to control and also has a very good range of different attacks. We can punch, kick backwards, pull off flying kicks, wriggle out of enemy grabs, and we can even punch baddies whilst they're on the floor with this game. This game has it all, and it is highly recommended for any beat-em-up fan. Don't be put off by the Spectrum's graphics and the colours, focus on the gameplay and you'll enjoy this game guaranteed. Gradius Gaiden is a 1997 Japanese sequel to the classic Konami arcades game which released back in 1985. This was released exclusively on its release for the PlayStation with the idea of improving the original gameplay mechanics and bringing the franchise into a modern era, utilising the 32-bit power of the PlayStation to do this. It did have a couple of re-releases as well, were supposedly being part of the Salamander Deluxe Pack Plus, but this was actually cancelled. However, it did end up on the Gradius collection much later on with the PSP when it actually got a release outside of Japan in 2006. Now, Gradius Gaiden was heavily praised positively on its release, and to date is considered as one of the franchise's best Gradius games. For those of you wondering what the term Gaiden actually means, well, it's Japanese for side story, so you could go as far as saying that with an English translation, this game could actually be titled as Gradius Side Story. So as for the game itself, we have a selection of which ship to control in this game, including the famous Vic Viper as well as the Lord British. The core gameplay pretty much remains the same as the previous Gradius games. Shoot down enemies, collect power-ups to enhance your chance of shooting down hordes of enemies, as well as taking on bosses. What makes this particular installment memorable is that it was the first Gradius game to feature a 2-player co-op mode. We also have a customization options menu, as well as 2 new shield editions added to this game. Again, like most of these sequels which had no arcade release, don't be fooled, Gradius Gaiden is one tough game, likely one of the hardest in the series without a doubt. Apart from its amazing gameplay and that feel-good element of blasting down enemy ships and ground enemies, the visuals are absolutely spectacular in Gradius Gaiden.
Attack from behind.
Now, surprisingly, the ridiculous amount of success of the original Atari 1985 arcade game of Paperboy never actually had an arcade sequel, which in hindsight is a little baffling. This game was huge at the time and was even featured in one of the Police Academy films. A very unique game which, to my knowledge, is still a fairly unique game to date. Damn, originally the arcade cabinet actually had handlebars as the main controls to play the game. On paper, no pun intended, a Paperboy riding upwards on at times very chaotic streets and throwing newspapers into people's houses to gain points seem a little boring, but in reality this was a highly addictive game. So why didn't it receive an arcade sequel? Well, it's very likely that, like other games with non-arcade sequels, publishers who originally gained the rights for the home conversions of the original game quite likely gained the rights to create sequels as a part of the agreement, just like Target Renegade did. Paperboy 2 remained the same game, although this release also lets us play as a paper girl and featured new perspectives of gameplay. We start the game off with this Super Nintendo version riding on the right hand side, which is of course different to the original game. As Paperboy continues, we then cross busy streets and ride on the left side of the road, as well as incorporating top-down segments too. Like I say, the gameplay remains the same and pretty much untouched. Paperboy 2 just added a couple of new updates to make the game a little more interesting how it looked. Paperboy 2 released on the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, PC, Game Boy, Game Gear, Mega Drive, NES, SNES and the ZX Spectrum in 1991. All different versions obviously received different ratings at the time due to hardware limitations and cutbacks on particular platforms. Personally, the SNES version is my favourite, whereas the NES version was criticised by some at the time with its poor camera angles. There was also an N64 game too, which released in 1999, although most will agree it wasn't the best Paperboy game in the world and was deemed as a just okay game. For those of you not in the know, which to be fair is fairly unlikely, Parodius looks very much like Gradius, and it was intentionally done too. Parodius is after a parody of Gradius, hence its name Parodius, a clever name that also sounds awesome, both being products of Konami. If you have never played a Parodius game, you are in for a game of absolute totally bizarreness, yet pure addictive side-scroll shoot-em-up action at the same time. This release, which I'm going to put on screen right now, otherwise I'm likely going to butcher the pronunciation of this, is the 4th game in the Parodius franchise, and I can honestly say that in terms of bizarreness, this sequel does not disappoint in any shape or form. Its colourful and uplifting tone is enough to give the most depressed person a big smile playing it. It first released on the Super Famicom in 1995 and was soon later released for the Sega Saturn as well as PlayStation in 1996, which featured update visuals and sounds. Sadly, this sequel only saw a release in Japan. The game itself is truly weird. It features very loud voice samples of a Japanese man shouting things out very loud, kind of done in a way that it appears to be some sort of Japanese game show. For those of you in the UK who remembers ITV's Talent on TV in the 1990s, the Japanese voice sampling truly sounds like something straight from that programme. As for the game itself, a truly spectacular game to play, but of course shoot-em-ups aren't for everybody admittedly. But really, if you are one of those people who believe that colourful and playful shoot-em-ups like this aren't right in any way, do yourself a favour and play this. You won't regret it, and you will also have the intrigue of what randomness you will see coming across your screen next.
Get ready.
Very likely any racing fan's favourite arcade game of the 1980s. Outrun released in arcades by Sega back in 1986. It then had an arcade sequel known as Turbo Outrun in 1989. It then had some strictly computer and console games, totally bypassing the arcade altogether. One of them notably was Outrun Europa, which was released for many 8-bit and 16-bit computers and consoles in 1991. Now skip ahead several years into the year of 2006 and Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast was released. This game was praised for pretty much everything and still is loved today, with mods releasing every now and again for its Windows PC version. It also released on the original Xbox, PlayStation 2 as well as the PlayStation Portable. Outrun 2006 was actually the 9th game in the franchise and was the last Outrun game to have a physical release, which is very bizarre considering its popularity to date. The original 1986 game was known for its spectacular visuals in its day, and so Sumo Digital, who developed this game for Sega, made sure to give it some love too. I bought this when it released, and let me tell you, this was one of the nicest looking games of its day, and it really doesn't look too bad today either, almost 20 years after its original release. I have actually made tutorial videos on upgrading the PC version of this game to make it look like a modern day game, which is worth checking out. So what is there to love about Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast? Well, everything really. It gives us the feel of the original arcade game that most people have fond memories of, but only modernises it. But not to the extent that totally ruins the legacy altogether. It comes with some very awesome arcade style music, including new versions of older songs from the game. We have many different modes of play for this game too. Drifting around corners truly feels amazing, and it's so nice to control too. It's a basic arcade racing game that truly stands the test of time. It's the true basic level of play in this game which is one of the highlights. It's not overly and ridiculously complex like some racing games were heading towards at the time of this game's release. Some of us older people do enjoy straight to the point games, and this is definitely one of them. If you missed this game on its release release, give it a play right now. You seriously won't regret it. The Ninja Warriors for the Super Nintendo was a follow-up of Taito's 1987 arcade release of the same name. Now, of course, in my opinion, graphically and in terms of details and sprites then, the 1987 arcade release was miles ahead of this 1995 Super Nintendo release. If you aren't sure how it looked originally, then go back to the introduction of this video and you'll see it there. The 1987 game still looks spectacular today with its level of detail. Now, push that aside, this game is also a nice looking follow-up game and plays almost very similar. The difference is with this release is that we have a choice of playing from 3 different ninja androids. Some might argue that the original game was a little repetitive and had unnecessarily long-winded levels. What this 1995 follow-up game does is reduces the length of levels by introducing much more variety with backgrounds whilst keeping the gameplay intact, although this SNES release also contains new special attacks which look very awesome when using them. Another selling point of the original arcade game from 1987 is that undoubtedly the music was and still is spectacular to listen to and a major point of discussion too. Although the music in this game isn't as grand, it holds its own fairly well and is a very good game for any side-scrolling beat-em-up fan. If the 1987 release had the nicer visuals and better music, then this follow-up game also by Taito had the better gameplay and controls. Sadly, this was only a one-player game, but I am sure the gameplay element made up for this. This version of Ninja Warriors has had recent remastered enhanced re-releases in recent times, which in the West was titled as The Ninja Saviors Return of the Warriors. If you cannot play the original Super Nintendo game, then check out the re-release which is on Steam, PlayStation 4 and also on the Nintendo Switch. One of the arcade's best loved games of the 1980s, specifically 1984, that was Bomb Jack by Tecmo. This actually finally got a sequel known as Mighty Bomb Jack, which was also developed by Tecmo for home computers and consoles between 1986 and 1992. This was such a popular game that it was literally ported to arcades in Japan with its name of Versus Mighty Bomb Jack, which featured a 2-player option. As for this game, this is Bomb Jack, or as I prefer to call it, Bomb Jack's scroll and screen version. Of course, the original game was a single screen platformer, whereas here in the sequel we have horizontal and vertical moving screens, which gives us a considerable amount of length in levels. Talking of levels, with Mighty Bomb Jack, each level is actually divided into 2 parts, which gives us the main level known as the Action Zone, and then we finish off with the second part known as the Royal Palace Rooms, as of which is just like playing the original Bomb Jack game, as these are single screen parts. We have lots of goodies to collect in this game, and we can generally find these in treasure chests, which are scattered everywhere. We also need to collect bombs, of course, as per usual for Bomb Jack. Mighty Bomb Jack, specifically for the Nintendo Entertainment System, is a bright and cheerful platformer, which was generally favoured for particular versions on its release back in the day. Although the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console edition, which came much later on, was slated at the time for being broken, according to some who reviewed it at the time. And that's it for taking a look at all of those arcade games which never had a sequel for the arcade. So like I said at the start of my video, if you missed part 1, then watch it right away. There's going to be games in there you might not know about or you might not have considered, so do check that one out. I'll leave the link for that in the comments section so you can watch that one. Anyways, again, thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.